Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation on polydrug use and drug market intersections within powerlifting cultures in remote southwest England. This is going to be part 2 of my presentation on findings from my recent article for Performance Enhancement and Health. So as before, I will leave a link in the description if you want to read the full article. And in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the intersections between image and performance enhancing drug supply and illicit drug markets identified in the Southwest region by participants in powerlifting culture. So, a bit of background and introduction to the relevance of understanding these drug market intersections and how polydrug supply occurs within these cultures. So, as we discussed in the last presentation, focusing on polydrug use among powerlifters was quite important for contextualizing harm and looking at potential harm reduction policies. And towards the end of that presentation, I highlighted how the context of access and supply could actually be very relevant to harm reduction. So Van der Ven and Mulroney have written about steroids and IPEDs more broadly and supply within bodybuilding cultures. And in the course of that research, what they noted is that social supply of these drugs, culturally embedded supply, often goes hand in hand with guidance, with advice, with these cultural scripts on actually how to inform those who are buying of how to use in a safe and appropriate manner. And this actually is a theme in quite a lot of research looking at IPED markets, that they're actually described as being distinct from traditional conceptions of illicit drug markets. Because by and large, what happens in these markets is, whether it's bodybuilders, whether it's powerlifters, within these sort of hardcore competitive IPED using communities, it tends to be that knowledge on how to use drugs is offered by those who are also supplying. So consequently, you wind up with actually a lot of important harm reduction advice being given, advice on how to use in a safer manner being given in the course of supply. So understanding the context of supply is actually really important to understanding, potential harm reduction policy directions. So within this context, as I've said, IPED markets broadly have been described as distinct to these traditional conceptions of illicit drug markets. There isn't the top-down control, there isn't the degree of violence, and actually most supply that occurs, it's either this social supply or it's what's termed minimally commercial supply. So it's not so much done for profit, it's more those involved in the culture sort of bringing others along and helping them along and helping them participate in the culture, sometimes for a small degree of profit to cover costs of own use and so forth. But this is sort of the conception of IPED markets that has come up in some research, but there has also been some research that perhaps challenges this idea of the IPED market as distinct from traditional conceptions of illicit drug markets. And a couple of examples in recent publications would be Densley et al. Talking about the overlaps and the links between the supply of other illicit drugs with steroids, and how steroids actually, to more conventionally understood drug dealers, are becoming this new profitable stock that they can supply as there's increasing demand for steroids. And Salinas, Flugate and Ralphs, in their 2019 publication exploring polydrug use and markets, which largely gave the framework for my article, they actually question whether the overlap that they've observed between illicit drug supply and those previously involved in illicit drug supply and IPED supply actually might challenge some of the notions of the IPED market as being distinct. And actually, if there are these entrants from more commercially oriented drug supply backgrounds, does this have the potential to drive out the culturally embedded suppliers who, offer this harm reduction advice and so forth, and actually mean that markets could be taken over by these more commercial drug market actors? So that's their sort of main contention, is they want to explore this trend. And what I aim to do in this presentation is sort of provide findings based on what I've heard about drug market intersections for the Southwest region, to sort of see the extent to which it supports or perhaps challenges the suggestions that Salinas et al. Make. So building on the discussion of polydrug use that we had in the last presentation, obviously there was a very clear overlap identified between polydrug and image and performance enhancing drug supply within these cultures. So we heard about how, you know, there was supply of opioids and benzos, which I'll focus on a bit in another slide or two time. But actually there does seem to be this overlap within these cultures between steroids and certain specific polydrugs. So it's very clear there is at least some degree of market overlap, even if, as identified in the previous presentation, some of that is just diverted medicines and so forth shared among friends. But it is relevant to tease apart actually where there is more explicit overlap with these illicit drug markets, as Salinas et al. Discuss. So when we're talking about actually drug access and supply, it's important, as well as IPEDs, and determining, you know, the extent to which those are based on these culturally embedded supply networks where advice is offered, to what extent are polydrugs supplied on that same basis, versus to what extent is polydrug access more based on, you know, receiving it from these sort of more stereotypical conceptions of drug dealers. And at the same time, when we move beyond the hardcore gym context, to what extent is steroid supply grounded in that? So building on Salinas et al.'s framework, this presentation is actually going to focus on these market intersections and explore some of the impacts these might have on risk and harm for steroid users and particularly powerlifters within the Southwest region. So how we aim to achieve this understanding, we're going to first explore the context of this social supply of polydrugs in gyms. So as we were saying about the culturally embedded supply of IPEDs, applying that to how polydrugs are supplied in gyms. We're then going to look at the overlaps that were discussed in my research between IPED and commercial illicit drug markets, building on Salinas et al.'s framework, and then sort of to contextualize how this intersects with risk and harm in this market. We're going to explore some perceptions of risk and violence within the Southwest IPED market, based on the experiences of a very prominent IPED supplier within that market, who is the supplier from my earlier presentation on steroid brewing. So we'll be linking back to that. And then I'm going to sort of bring it all together with a discussion around the importance of these findings, and then offer some concluding remarks. So as I said, there's been some research into different gym cultures, hardcore gym cultures particularly, that's noticed the prevalence of IPED social supply. So unlike stereotypical conceptions of illicit drug markets, IPEDs are seen as being this distinct form of supply where bodybuilders, powerlifters and so forth are offering these drugs for minimal profit and sort of almost in an altruistic way of helping out others within their culture. So people access the steroids from them and advice is given on how you should use them appropriately, what's the best approach to them, and often done for minimal profit, particularly within these hardcore cultures. So within my research, actually this was replicated, these norms of social supply and minimally commercial supply. So whilst there were some instances in the more commercial type gyms of people being more profit oriented, that we had an example of a personal trainer who was talking about another trainer he knew that sold steroids to a client and talked about, you know, the amounts he charged him and the profit. This is sort of from those outside of these hardcore cultures such as powerlifters, and we'll return to those individuals a bit later in this presentation. But certainly within the hardcore cultures, among the powerlifters particularly, there was this real trend of actually it's not about commercial purposes necessarily. There's sort of this norm of actually we supply each other to help each other out, and we just make enough profit to cover the cost of our own use and so forth. So I have this example quote from Rich saying, I wasn't making a profit, I just bought the steroids, off Jim, then I sold it on to my mate. I was like, look, I'm buying this for my mate, and Jim was like, yeah, that's cool, didn't like up the price or anything. So it's understood within this setting, it's Jim is offering them to Rich for cheap because they're friends, they're both powerlifters, and then Rich is saying, actually, I want to buy steroids for my friend over here, and Jim is still, that's fine, I'll sell it to you for the same price, you can go and sell it on to him, and so very much framed within this idea of actually we're not here to profit off other people, we're helping out our friends within our culture. And this was prevalent throughout the research when looking at powerlifters and those hardcore sort of gym users. Now, this actually does tie in with what I was saying about culturally embedded advice and actually how norms of use and what's considered proper use of drugs actually comes to be imparted on buyers within these contexts. So Antonopoulos and Hall and Van der Ven and Mulrooney have talked about this before, that actually there is perhaps a harm reduction process in these more experienced users informing buyers on how to use safely when they are supplying them. And similarly, in my research, we saw this theme coming through. So I have this quote from Mariusz, who was saying, when there are new buyers in the gym and they go to someone asking to buy steroids, he says, quote, obviously the guy offers him things he knows he should use first, test and whatnot. So this idea, you've got this person who is new to steroids, goes to the guy asking for advice, and the guy, rather than think, what is the thing that I can profit the most off of, is saying, okay, you're a new user, what should you use for a new cycle, your first cycle? It should be testosterone just as your base. And then where he says whatnot, that's obviously any sort of PCT or accessory drugs. So very much grounded within this idea of there are appropriate ways to use, there are proper ways to use, and this is what the sort of hardcore gym sellers guide new buyers towards. And there was some discussion about, the limits to this, whether there are buyers who are insistent they want a different product. If they're insistent, no, I've heard about Tren, I've been reading about Tren, I really want to try that. The extent to which sellers will try and guide them away from that versus the extent to which they might actually sign off on that and maybe still look at it as a sale. And Jim, who we're going to cite quite a lot later, he sort of discussed this process and he said, basically, I price things based on how much of a cunt you are. So if there was someone who, was taking on board his advice and was interested in, and part of the powerlifting culture, he would obviously not charge them very much at all. And then if there was somebody who wasn't listening to any of the advice and was adamant they wanted something which wasn't suitable or whatever, then he would charge more. Now this, of course, was prior to Jim moving to becoming more of a wholesale supplier and not dealing with that type of person, which we'll cover later. But that gives you an idea of sort of how culturally embedded systems of advice in gyms actually informed how steroids were supplied and therefore also had an influence on actually systems of how harm is regulated within these cultures. So within my research, very much in line with that existing research on social supply of steroids in gyms in relation to the hardcore cultures. Now, the reason I explore that when I'm talking about polydrugs and illicit drug use is that actually in the first instance, as I sort of teased in the last presentation, the use of certain polydrugs which were more normalized within these cultures or seen as more acceptable within these cultures, actually those polydrugs were also supplied in a very similar fashion. These sort of social supply norms, advice given, minimal profit made, and so forth. So to give some examples of the drugs that I sort of outlined as powerlifters seeing these as more acceptable in the prior presentation, Jim talked about the use of ephedrine and buying that in the form of chesties when it was available. When chesties became restricted, you couldn't buy them off the shelf. he was still sourcing them or sourcing ephedrine pills somehow. And he would quite literally share these out in the gym with people he knew. So he would charge a minimal amount to people he didn't know who were kind of involved in the culture and wanted them. And people who he was friends with in the gym, he would quite literally just give them ephedrine pills. So that's one clear example of this social supply norm from the steroids being carried over to some of the polydrugs, in this case stimulants, but of course those stimulants very much treated as a pre-workout within this culture, so treated as enhancement drugs. So some of the later drugs that I've got on this side are distinguished a little further from those because they're not as easy to just kind of perceive or contextualize as being purely enhancement drugs. They are more obviously moving into the sort of polydrug territory. In the last presentation as well, I discussed JC, who, when I injured my back, just offered me opioids. He could tell I was in pain and was like, "Oh, I've got some opioids in my bag if you want them," and he happened to have morphine sulfate. But that shows you that kind of normal supply actually is, oh, this guy's injured himself, he clearly needs something, so let's just offer it to him. So there is very much this kind of social and cultural element to actually friendship supply as it occurs in these spaces, perhaps parallels some of the friendship supply that we see in some other cultures, and particularly sort of cannabis culture, but more broadly than that. But moving beyond that sort of pure social supply and sort of giving drugs to friends and to people who are well known, actually where minimally commercial supply did occur and there was some degree of profit made in relation to polydrugs, this is perhaps more interesting to explore when we're interested in this idea of polydrug markets and market intersections. So in the case of diazepam, Jim was sourcing this alongside, he was sourcing and supplying steroids, and diazepam being seen as this accessory drug to steroids to manage some of the side effects, such as insomnia, such as anger issues or mood swings. Actually, a lot of steroid suppliers would source diazepam as well, and very often sourced from sort of the internet and from these black market or grey market sites where it's not actual prescription medicine. And as an example of kind of minimally commercial supply and how that operated in the gym, Rich was talking about buying diazepam off Jim and made a comment about, I paid him the price that he pays to get 100, and then he took, I think he took 20 of them. So Rich wound up with 80 pills having paid for the price of 100, but actually Jim wasn't putting any profit on top. It's just Jim, as a steroid user, wanted some diazepam himself on hand so that he could use them when he needed them. So that was kind of the profit that he took, was just a payment in kind of, okay, you pay the full price so I can order this 100 pills and I'll give you 80 of them and then I'll keep 20 for my own personal use. So that's one example of this type of minimally commercial supply that occurred. And sticking with Rich, because he also gave me a really interesting example of going beyond friends and beyond those explicitly kind of looking to access polydrugs in relation to IPED use. And he was talking about there were two students in the gym that he was training in. So he was training in this gym in Plymouth, and he had access, of course, to methylphenidate, which he got from a friend in the form of a diverted prescription. He was using that, and these students in the gym, he obviously discussed it with them, or they found out he was using it, and they wanted to buy some of him to use for their studies. Now, what's interesting is he talked about selling these methylphenidate pills onto them. So he had accessed them as a diverted prescription, and then he sold them. But actually, he was selling them for £1 a pill to these students, which was about sort of half the going market rate that you would pay if you were sorting them from like the university or from other similar sources. So even though he's selling them outside of the powerlifting context, because these are guys he knows in the gym, and because he's sort of I guess buying into this culture of social supply within the gym, and he's selling within the gym, he's actually selling for a lot cheaper than if those same students had bought those drugs at the university, for instance. So that's an interesting one to tease apart, just that actually this polydrug supply within this cultural space, even when it's not specifically linked to the supply of steroids, still mirrors those kind of norms that we see for IPED supply. And this does indicate that actually polydrug supply within hardcore cultures does seem to be distinct from traditional conceptions of illicit drug markets, even when we're talking about the same drugs being supplied, when we're talking about benzodiazepines, and when we're talking about certain opiates. So this would seem to indicate that actually these prior explorations, which suggest that the market for drugs in hardcore gyms is different to traditional conceptions of illicit drug markets, this can extend beyond the steroids to actually polydrugs that are associated in some way with these lifting cultures and seen as acceptable within these cultures. So again, this prevalence of social supply, actually, it's interesting to think about how this intersects with the use of these drugs. So there is social supply prevalent in gyms because these drugs are popular. There's some demand for them, particularly thinking of benzos and how they intersect with steroid use. But also perhaps some use is encouraged by this prevalence of social supply because there is this guidance given of, oh, if you're taking this, you might want to take these as well to manage the effects, and I can supply you those. So there seems to be some intersection between what are seen as these acceptable polydrugs and what the cultural norms of use around those drugs are, as well as the supply. But actually, as I said in making the recommendations in the previous presentation, and as I say in the article that these two presentations are based on, actually this might be relevant to formulating policy around harm reduction for polydrug users within these cultures, because actually if there are these prevailing norms of social supply and advice being given to users in gyms, then perhaps harm reduction outreach that uses those individuals who are engaged in these processes of supplying gyms would be one of the best ways that you could in fact address harms related to polydrug use with steroids. And I gave an example of sort of an outreach program that could work there. So very significant to consider the ways in which polydrug supply mirrors IPED supply within these cultures. But building on Salinas et al.'s work, actually it's also very relevant to explore perhaps the other side to this market, which is where actually things operated in the other direction. So people who were interested in accessing steroids perhaps were getting those from individuals involved in more stereotypically conceived illicit drug supply and more commercial actors. So as previously noted, there's been some research which has shown these overlaps between IPED supply and these more illicit drug markets, people involved in supplying cocaine and that sort of thing. And Densley et al. And Salinas et al. Really clear examples of actually more Class A drug suppliers, more commercially oriented drug suppliers, realizing that there was profit to be made from the supply of steroids. Now that steroids are sort of a bit more mainstream, there's more demand from them, and people want to know where they can access them beyond perhaps the confines of the hardcore cultures that historically have had these norms of culturally embedded supply. So building on this, Salinas et al. Sort of note that this is important when we want to understand harm related to these drugs and related to these cultures, because actually there is the potential, if more commercial drug suppliers begin to see steroids as profitable, that they could sort of take over existing IPED markets, either literally through force, or perhaps through beginning to supply steroids and bringing more police interest, which could push out sort of the bodybuilders and powerlifters who previously got into supply, seeing it as quite low risk. If there's more police interest in these markets because there are these Class A suppliers, maybe that just sort of pushes them out. So whichever of those occurred, obviously this would have the potential to increase risk to users, because you would no longer be getting that same sort of advice and guidance given when steroid supply occurred, if the steroid market is taken over by these more commercial actors rather than culturally embedded ones. So building on Salinas et al.'s suggestion, actually what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is explore these intersections between commercial illicit drug markets and the IPED market in the remote Southwest. So Plymouth and sort of small rural towns in that region. So I have an example from my research actually of this individual, Simon, who he wasn't a powerlifter, he was a more casual gym user, trained for size and trained to sort of overcome insecurities. And he was talking about actually how he first accessed steroids. It wasn't from a bodybuilder or a powerlifter in the gym, this kind of culturally embedded supply. It was from a guy who he knew as like a drug dealer. So he says, all I know is I phoned a friend, told him what I was after. He said, no problems, I'll get it for you. He came around with the steroids and I gave him the money. I don't know where he got them from. I knew he could get them, so I got them through him. So this is a guy that Simon met in prison originally, a guy who he knew as a drug dealer, and he said, I wanted steroids because I was training in the gym. I didn't know the guys in the gym who would sell them, so I got them through this guy. So clearly there is this overlap occurring between drug dealers, as more conventionally understood, and steroid supply. So the question is, does this challenge the narratives of the IPED market as distinct, and does that challenge sort of some of the things that have been said about lower risk and more potential for effective harm reduction in that market? So an interesting theme that came through in my research was actually that some quite informed participants in the local IPED market actually described how they perceived there to be two parallel markets in the region. So both Jim, a wholesale IPED supplier, and Martin, who was a powerlifter but also had some associations with people around town more broadly, had worked the doors, was a well-known MMA fighter, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter. Both of them actually used the same terminology, and they pointed out there's this one market made up of sportsmen who supply steroids, and the other is made up of lads, drug-dealing lads. And this, of course, lad is quite a broad term. It gets applied slightly differently in different contexts, but I think Martin's quote here really summarizes who he's talking about when he uses that term. So Martin, talking about this overlap between the markets, between steroids and illicit drugs, says a lot of them don't go hand in hand, being the sportsman market, but a lot of the times they do, especially if they're that, gym-going lad who normally works the doors, who deal a lot of coke, but a lot of them deal steroids as well. Like, it is only a small hick town, so they probably have to diversify and sell as much as possible. But as far as I know, there aren't many like, no, I only do this. Because if you say, can you get this? They say, yeah, all right. So this acknowledgement that actually, yeah, they don't always go hand in hand. If you're in a hardcore gym and you're buying from a bodybuilder or a powerlifter, they're probably not involved in this illicit drug trade. But actually, if you go to the sort of stereotypical guy who works the doors who sells coke, he probably sells steroids as well. And he, if he's a doorman especially, he's probably training in the gym and using steroids. So Martin certainly noticed this overlap, and Jim talked about this same overlap. So participants very much suggested actually there are two distinct markets, and that one may be seen as perhaps different to the stereotypical drug market, but the other really much did kind of fit that stereotype of, now they're these coke dealers who work the doors and they'll also sell you steroids, right? So the question is, if we're seeing a rise in this type of individual, these sort of cocaine suppliers and so forth, selling steroids, does this indicate a shift towards more commercial actors being involved in IPED supply? And does this therefore undermine the culturally embedded sportsman suppliers that are seen as like this other market? as Salinas et al. Sort of suggests could occur. Now, interestingly, when we're talking about this transition and the prevalence of these sort of Class A drug suppliers now selling steroids, Salinas et al. In their piece talk about this gym owner Caesar, who actually he used profits from selling cocaine to set up his gym, and then transitioned over from, he said he used to sell cocaine big fucking time, and then he made this transition after buying the gym towards selling more IPEDs because, quote, it's much safer than selling coke. IPEDs are not a priority for the police. Now, so this shows how actually there could be this potential for these Class A illicit drug market actors to make this transition and sort of take over IPED markets. And what's interesting is that a commercial supplier who I spoke to in my research, Tyson, he actually had a very similar background and motivations. He talked about he used to supply cocaine and ketamine, and then he made the transition over to steroids because he perceived it as being lower risk, because he didn't want that risk, the police involvement and so forth, that came with cocaine and ketamine. So he made that transition, seeing it was just as popular now, just as profitable to be selling steroids. So he would sell that, and this was outside of the hardcore gym context. This was more to, he talked about how everyone wanted to buy it because, all right, so you want to be like the Kardashians, or you want to be like Love Island, and it was all about the image-focused buyers, but very much in terms of the transition from Class A over to IPEDs, he had very similar motivations to what Caesar in Salinas et al. Said. So clearly within my research, actually, some of those same patterns of these commercial illicit drug suppliers coming into the IPED market was occurring. So even though Tyson was distinct from this sportsman market that Martin and Jim talked about, because he hadn't come from being a powerlifter and he wasn't supplying to those hardcore subcultures, he was supplying more on the image-oriented side. Actually, it is worth exploring what powerlifters' perceptions of these market intersections were in a bit more depth, because it is relevant to understand when they're talking about these two distinct markets, actually, to what extent are they fully distinct? To what extent do they intersect? And what impacts could this have on the culturally embedded gym-based market that we've previously heard is actually lower risk and positive from a harm reduction and advice perspective? So in seeking to answer this question, actually, one of the key ways that IPED markets have been noted as being distinct when discussing, the difference between these and more conventionally understood illicit drug markets is actually by situating explorations in relation to risk and market violence. So Kumar et al. Do a piece on this, and actually that piece was also set in Plymouth. So some overlap in findings, possibly just as a result of exploring the same market to some degree, even though my study also went out into the more rural towns in the region. But Kumar et al. Ground their analyses in market risk, market violence, when they're noting the steroid market as being distinct. So using that same framework to explore actually the overlaps between illicit drug markets and steroid markets is quite useful for understanding this perhaps separation between the sportsman market and this other market. So Jim, who, as I noted, he was a wholesale IPED importer, manufacturer and supplier, very prominent in the region, and as I said in my presentation on steroid brewing, which was focused on Jim's operation and sort of breaking down actually the details of his operation, Jim sort of discussed how his steroids were used as far north as Glasgow. They were used on the national strongman stage. So a very prominent figure actually in the local IPED market. So useful to explore his experiences of market risk, market violence, and market intersections as a way of really understanding this market. He's sort of a very relevant figure for such a case study. So actually, Jim did himself highlight that there was this overlap between more conventionally understood drug dealers within the region's gyms and actually, the steroid market that existed. So he talked about this local amateur bodybuilder I knew from Dave's gym, which was in a small town somewhere outside of Plymouth. And actually, Dave's was like the epitome of the hardcore sort of spit and sawdust gym. And this guy, nicknamed D-Bol Dan, I was aware he sold steroids in this gym. And Jim actually made me aware, no, this guy is a cocaine supplier, and he was actually one of the more prominent cocaine suppliers in the town. So we had this interaction, and I've recorded this field diary note here. So I had seen D-Bol Dan in Champions, and I knew D-Bol Dan normally trained in Dave's. So I brought it up with Jim. Oh, I saw D-Bol Dan. And he says, oh yeah, he was kicked out of Dave's. Because you know how the owners, because Dave was no longer the owner at this point, you know how his daughter and Tommy Johnston and that lot used to do loads of coke and start shitting all the bars around town. It was D-Bol Dan who sold it to them. So this is where I first become aware that D-Bol Dan is actually involved in cocaine supply. But Jim, as this kind of prominent figure in the local IPED market and having these connections to, of course, he's selling to the people in the gyms, D-Bol Dan could well have been one of his customers, since D-Bol Dan was also selling steroids. Jim actually seemed to be quite aware of his operation. So actually, in the course of discussing D-Bol Dan's operation with me and just detailing what he was aware of, what he had heard, Jim actually sort of expanded on this and talked about some of the violence in the market associated with guys I knew as steroid users and steroid suppliers, but who actually, it transpired, were involved in cocaine supply. So this same interaction, Jim later said, you know who in Dave's you absolutely wouldn't want to start shit with though? Farmer John. If D-Bol Dan and that lot have any problems, they send in Farmer John to sort it out. He's fucking burnt someone's house down, pulled guns on people, like a proper handgun. And my response was just, Jesus. And Jim said, I know, last person you'd expect, right? And at the time it was. So how I knew Farmer John, you know, I had met Farmer John in Dave's, and you know, he seemed like a really sound guy when I met him, and you know, perhaps still is. This is the thing, you know, we have these people who are scary, violent drug suppliers, but actually when we meet them in different contexts, perhaps we don't get that impression. So I met Farmer John in Dave's when I was sort of first started training, and he, you know, he offered to sell me some testosterone and said, you know, he'd been using test, he'd been seeing really good gains, and if I ever wanted any, if I was ever interested, he'd sell it to me. So we actually got on quite well. And he was working security, he was a doorman, and he said, oh, because I was unemployed at the time, he was like, yeah, if you want to get your door license, I can hook you up. I can call the person and arrange for the training course and so on. So yeah, so I just knew Farmer John. I knew him as a bodybuilder. I knew he sold steroids, but that was kind of all I knew about him. So this was quite an interesting revelation that Jim actually told me, oh no, he's been involved in this stuff. I'm aware of this going on. Jim being a very prominent market actor on the steroid side and sort of quite informed and having connections to these people. And yeah, Farmer John subsequently winds up going to prison after being caught with 7 grand's worth of cocaine, 4 grand's worth of cash, an illegal Smith & Wesson handgun, and an unlicensed shotgun. So definitely, you know, as Jim said, oh yeah, he's got this proper handgun. He later gets caught with this proper illegal handgun. And court reporting talked about him being involved with organized gangs. His justification, his lawyer argued that actually because he owed this drug debt to this gang, he was then selling on cocaine to try and be able to pay it off. So based on all this, it seems Jim actually, what he was telling me about D-Bol Dan, John, and their friend Kane, who also was arrested, this with amphetamines rather than cocaine, but similarly had a handgun. He had a Mauser illegal handgun as well. This does seem to have been accurate information. So these 3 guys who I knew sold steroids in the local market actually all involved in this sale of illicit drugs and involved in some degree of violence, having guns and so forth, right? So given this, and given these individuals were actually they were prominent enough in the local steroid market They weren't necessarily the biggest actors, but within Dave's gym, these guys were known as, these are guys you can buy steroids off, right? So if Dave's is a hardcore gym, and these are kind of the guys who are known as steroid users in that gym, clearly there is some market intersection between these kind of violent market actors, more conventionally understood drug dealers, with these links to organized gangs. Does that perhaps evidence what Salinas et al. Suggest about the possibility for takeover of this market? Now, actually, the interesting thing to consider here is what was the perceived impact of their presence in the IPED market, as opposed to, what charges were brought against them more broadly, what activities were they involved in more broadly. When Jim was talking about risk in this market, which I discuss in relation to his experiences as a steroid brewer and supplier, actually I asked him about, do you see this market as being violent? What were you worried about your operation at any time? And he just dismissed this. He was like, nah, there were other guys involved in brewing and supplying. They came and went, and we were never worried they would report us to the authorities or anything. So when I first asked him about risk, he didn't even think about violence. He said, nah, we weren't worried they would report us. And then I was sort of more explicit, and I was like, but what about violence? Because our interview took place after this conversation, when he had told me about D-Bol Dan and Farmer John and what they were involved in. And Jim actually said, no, he wasn't worried at all, because his experience within the steroid market itself was that there wasn't any violence associated with that, and any violence that involved IPED sellers was actually just the crossover to these other markets that they were involved in. So whilst there was clearly this overlap with the same market actors involved in cocaine and amphetamine supply, as well as selling steroids, including actually in some hardcore gyms such as Dave's, actually what Jim's saying about perceptions and experiences kind of illustrates the need to conceptualize these markets as relatively separate, with just this nominal intersection, as he suggested. You have this sportsman market, and then you have the kind of lad dealer market, but actually, so long as you're a sportsman and you're sticking with supply within gyms, there doesn't seem to be any perceived risk of violence from Jim's perspective. So as far as Jim saw it, if you were a supplier who was just buying steroids to then sell on in the gym, or if you were a buyer in a gym who sort of came from that sporting background and you were just looking to buy steroids, actually you wouldn't even notice the presence of these guys. You would be entirely unaffected by them. And as I said, I had met Farmer John in Dave's. He had offered to sell me testosterone in Dave's, and yet I had no clue whatsoever he was involved in those kind of activities, up until Jim said, and then subsequently on his arrest, that kind of confirmed it. So it's interesting when we're talking about market risk, and are these individuals going to push out culturally embedded market actors, is that actually, if you ground your analysis in what are the experience of those buyers within those culturally embedded IPED markets, actually they seem to be unaffected by the prevalence of these actors. And although Salinas et al. Caution, maybe these individuals will bring more police attention, the reality is, from speaking to people and having some context, I'm aware that sort of police officers at Devon and Cornwall were using steroids, and also it's very normal to kind of turn a blind eye. So perhaps even if these market actors are bringing some degree of attention, I think it's very telling when Farmer John was arrested and they listed he had all this cocaine and he had these 2 guns. No mention of steroids in those arrest reports. So that I think is something worth highlighting as well. So if we want to understand actual harm and actual risk in this market, actually, as Jim suggests, going by the experiences of sort of the typical IPED suppliers in gyms, and even at his own level, as a wholesale supplier, not experiencing, not feeling any increased risk from the presence of these actors, and also looking at the experiences of just regular buyers in hardcore gyms, actually, there doesn't really seem to be this worry of a takeover or of increased risk. And part of this, Jim sort of attributed to the openness of the IPED market, how essentially anybody can kind of come in from being a sportsman. You can be a bodybuilder or a powerlifter and start buying IPEDs to cover the cost of your own use, and you can buy them from a wholesale guy, or you can buy them from the internet and then, you know, build up more of an operation. So Jim, in his own experiences, as I covered in my presentation, looking at his market experience as a steroid brewer, he actually talks about how he just drifted into supply, and how actually the market was so open and easy to access that actually, you know, people came and went in this market all the time without any issue. So very much from his perspective, there was nothing to indicate like a takeover of the market by these commercially oriented actors, because anybody interested in setting up essentially could. So I've sort of noted that there's been some other research exploring how illicit drug markets in certain geographies and contexts can be quite bottom up as well. And I know Ross Coombe has published on this, that the lack of rigid organizational structure actually means that there's not tight control of these markets, and therefore there's not really any takeover of the markets. People can just kind of drift into supply and drift out of it again. So it seems that gym-based supply by powerlifters and by bodybuilders and so on essentially existed independent of these commercial market actors with links to organized crime, because actually, so long as you stuck to IPED supply, these market entrants who were also involved in illicit drug supply didn't particularly interfere with you. There wasn't any perception of them, you know, being rivals. So with most IPED users either buying through sort of minimally commercial suppliers in gyms, you know, buying through the bodybuilder in the gym or buying through the gym owner and so forth, or they're sourcing them online, you know, through online pharmacies or through bodybuilding forums and so forth. Actually, commercial drug suppliers, even though to some extent those who did buy from them, people like Simon, perhaps didn't receive the same level of advice that you would receive in the culturally embedded market. Actually, this doesn't seem to be necessarily the typical form of access. And indeed, some of those guys involved in commercial drug supply, actually, because they're doormen and they're big, like Farmer John and like the guys Martin was talking about, if they are supplying IPEDs, are able to give that sort of advice from being participants in gym cultures as well. So it's interesting to think about that actually the presence of drug dealers as more conventionally understood doesn't really seem to have had a significant impact on those norms of supply within my own research, barring the few cases such as Simon. Now, this actually mirrors some of the findings that Katinka van der Ven and her colleagues found in Australia, where they were talking about IPED supply. And actually, they noted that some of it is related to criminal gangs, but actually the vast majority of supply that occurs is completely independent of these groups. So supply in gyms, even if there are gangs operating in the area, it's kind of tangential to the actual context of supply experienced by your typical buyer and supplier. So my work in the UK very much supporting that Australian experience. So in terms of market structures and discussing the significance of my findings, first of all, clearly there is this overlap that's been spoken about by Densley, that's been spoken about by Salinas et al., and, you know, Finicure et al. Earlier than this, there has been some talk about this overlap. So my research does definitely show some degree of overlap between steroid supply and supply of illicit drugs, sometimes within the confines of culturally embedded supply, so supply of benzos to other powerlifters, but also in terms of this more what was termed the lad market of doormen and so forth who sell drugs but also sell steroids. But, you know, Jim, being this very prominent actor in the local IPED market, he sold wholesale to 40 plus suppliers in the region who would then sell on in the gyms and were quite prominent actors, you know, the larger suppliers in their gyms. Actually, the fact that he, as this real insider, suggested that yes, these people are prevalent, but they're not really affecting the traditional culturally embedded gym-based IPED market. That's quite important to understand, that yes, this overlap did occur, but didn't particularly have any impact on the existing norms of supply as they previously occurred. So actually, by locating risk in relation to the sort of typical experiences of buyers and sellers, rather than focusing on these broader overlaps where we do see this violence, but it's associated with the other drugs that these market actors who happen to sell steroids are also involved in, this is actually quite significant in conceptualizing how access and supply actually occur. And it's clear that this culturally embedded supply that actually has been seen as a positive for those interested in harm reduction because of the advice mechanisms and sort of informal status mechanisms that operate there, that seems to continue essentially unaffected, even if we do have those cases such as Simon, who are accessing their IPEDs through these more commercially oriented sources. So yes, there does seem to be overlap, but it doesn't necessarily bring more risk. However, one thing I caution in the paper, which I think is important to bring up when thinking about risk in the market, is what are the sort of secondary risks that it might bring. So there wasn't the perception of the type of risks Salinas et al. Warn about, of markets being taken over, at least not explicitly in my research. But I question whether there's the possibility, if these individuals get involved in steroid brewing, as opposed to people such as Jim, who was very attendant to wanting to make a good quality product, being a powerlifter, if they sort of get pushed out of the market by more commercial actors who are importing steroids and brewing them and might make them to a lesser quality, what impacts could that have? On the other hand, of course, Kumar et al.'s work actually precedes my work looking at Jim's experiences as a brewer, and they found that steroid quality was quite poor to begin with. So it's entirely possible there are already issues in that area. But still something I think could be worth sort of keeping an eye on and exploring is actually, are these more commercially oriented actors going to take over and become the primary labs involved in supply? Or, on the other hand, homebrewing could literally take off as a more decentralized alternative. So we talked about the bottom-up steroid market. Is the brewing of steroids and creating a product, is that going to become more decentralized? And my book on the online market for steroids, which is coming very soon, that goes into a bit more depth on actually how that's occurring. And Rebecca Brendan, of course, has written a bit about that. So that's an area that might be worth focusing on, thinking about market intersections. But I don't necessarily have a concrete perspective on which way that would go, even if there is this kind of potential for overlap and takeover of elements. But discussing these findings, it's important to note when I'm talking about what my participants experienced, we have to keep in mind that this research took place in a very remote region of the country, remote from sort of the typical hubs of drug supply. So, I mean, if you read some of the news reports on arrests for cocaine and other drugs in Devon, very often you'll hear it's people who came down from Liverpool, people who came from London as like the original sources of these drugs. So being quite remote, is there the possibility that this affects findings? So one way it could affect findings, as Martin suggested, was that is there a greater overlap in markets just because actually those in these more remote areas, they have this economic pressure to actually diversify more and supply a bit of everything, so because Martin highlighted that he thought that could be important to note, that's worth bringing up, is actually how does the remote geography of the research affect the norms of supply that occur? Sort of looking at the opposite side, but still very much focused on the geography. Actually, if we look at some of the research into county lines drug supply, such as that by Moyle and Kumar, they actually talk about how in isolated regions, criminal enterprises don't necessarily push out existing market actors for purely logistic reasons. That actually, if you're quite distant from a hub, it can make sense to have sort of locals supply on behalf of more organized groups rather than kind of take over markets. So perhaps that could be a factor which influences the perceptions that my participants had, is that because of the remote geography, actually they're in areas where you don't see commercial drug suppliers pushing out locals, even when it comes to these illicit drugs, which again, looking at the court reporting for Farmer John's case, potentially was what was happening with him, where it was argued that he had this drug debt to an organized criminal group. Perhaps he was sort of the local. And of course, when we're talking about the prominence of doormen involved in this type of supply, that could also be quite indicative of actually this is what's happening, because doormen would be sort of a logical choice for locals supplying on behalf of gangs. So potentially, developing what Martin said, maybe these overlaps are overestimated in my research, or drawing on sort of the research that Moyle and Kuma have done and developing that in light of my findings. It's also plausible that because they're in such a remote county, that could underestimate the potential for commercial illicit drug suppliers to take over markets relative to other geographies. And of course, Tyson, who I cited earlier, he came down from Birmingham. So obviously within that type of larger city, more hub context, that type of takeover could more plausibly be occurring. So although my findings, they don't necessarily support the suggestion that commercial drug suppliers are taking over and altering the traditional culturally embedded IPED market in gyms, there is the possibility that actually my findings are quite geographically specific, being based in quite a remote part of the country. So this can help inform Salinas et al.'s analyses, but in order to fully understand, the complete context of market intersections, obviously continuing work, broader, in-depth research of this type would need to be done and look at a variety of different market contexts in different geographies and sort of explore that more in aggregate to see whether my work, of course, is just an outlier because of its geographic location. Now, having said all of that, what can we say from the perspective of sort of making recommendations and so forth? I think one of the major points Salinas et al. Make, and I know other authors, Katinka van der Ven has talked about this, one of the significant points that he raises is actually that if we have this worry of these illicit commercial market actors coming into IPEDs, and therefore we need to more heavily police IPED supply, we need to increase scheduling, actually that's likely to push the market further towards those criminal enterprises, because now you have this sort of higher cost of entry, greater risk for those more traditional culturally embedded IPED suppliers. So actually it's entirely possible that if there's concerns over these illicit market entrants coming into these markets, if we have more of a criminal justice type response to that, we could in fact increase harm in the local markets, because we would be shutting out those traditional powerlifters and bodybuilders and so forth who would have otherwise supplied. So with that in mind, perhaps it's better to focus more on efforts about developing that sort of culturally embedded advice mechanisms and the sort of informal mechanisms by which harm reduction occurs in gyms. And of course, I gave some policy suggestions such as outreach workers and so forth in my previous presentation. So I think in terms of recommendations, that is probably the key thing to take away from this discussion of market intersections. But just as a final thought, it did occur to me, I've got these findings of overlap, people like Debo Dan, Farmer John and Kane. These are these stereotypical dangerous drug dealers, and they're also involved in hardcore training. They're amateur bodybuilders, they go to the Spit and Sawdust Gym Daves. But is there a possibility this is just sort of incidental overlap, because the kind of working class men with fewer options will be simultaneously the ones most likely to be drawn to drug dealing, as well as the ones most likely to be drawn to these hardcore cultures? So I've just got this example of Lee Murray, UFC fighter, famous fighter and gangster, was involved in a lot of drug dealing when he was younger, eventually went to prison for a heist of a Securitas depot in Morocco. Is there necessarily a causative link between people involved with organized criminal gangs and illicit drugs being involved in IPED supply? Or is it just that there seems to be a correlation because the background of the type of person likely to be involved in that supply also means that they're likely to be involved in hardcore gym training or MMA fighting or something like that? So I think that's just worth discussing, this kind of overlap between causation and correlation. But in terms of policy recommendations, doesn't affect what I was saying before, of course, about focusing more on harm reduction. So with that said, this kind of closes out my discussion of drug market intersections in remote Southwest England. So hopefully you found it informative.